The daily life of Queen Cleopatra. The routine of a queen. When you think of Cleopatra, perhaps you imagine her stepping dramatically onto a barge covered in gold, perfumed sails catching the wind, musicians playing as Roman generals fall under her spell. But in reality, most of Cleopatra's life was not filled with spectacle or seduction. Like any monarch in the ancient world, the vast majority of her time was consumed by the ordinary and the tedious. Daily routines, administrative work, rituals that had to be observed, and the endless cycles of keeping both her court and her country running. To understand Cleopatra's daily life, you have to begin with where she lived. Cleopatra spent most of her reign in Alexandria, the city founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE. By the time she ruled in the 1st century BCE, Alexandria had grown into one of the greatest cities of the Mediterranean. It had wide boulevards, harbors that bustled with ships, and a population estimated at around 500,000 people, which was massive for the time. The royal palace complex where Cleopatra resided no longer exists. It lies submerged beneath the waters of modern Alexandria's coast, but ancient writers describe it as an expansive, marble-filled residence, complete with colonnades, courtyards, gardens, and private chambers. It was not just her home, but also the central hub of political life in Egypt. Morning rituals. Cleopatra's day would typically begin at dawn. Like all monarchs of her era, she was closely tied to the religious and ceremonial life of her kingdom. The Egyptians believed their ruler was not merely a political figure, but also a divine one, chosen by the gods to maintain balance and order, or ma'at. For Cleopatra, this meant her mornings were rarely private. She would awaken to servants and attendants who prepared her chambers, brought in scented oils, and laid out garments. The garments she wore were not the shimmering golden costumes imagined in Hollywood films, but rather linen, the everyday fabric of Egypt. Linen could range from coarse to fine, depending on quality, and Cleopatra, as queen, would have had the softest, most delicately woven cloth. Jewelry was essential, not necessarily for luxury, but as a statement of power. Gold rings, amulets, and necklaces were reminders of her divine right to rule, as well as symbols meant to ward off misfortune. After dressing, she would have taken part in religious devotions. Even though Cleopatra was ethnically Macedonian Greek, descended from the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt since the time of Alexander, she presented herself as fully Egyptian. She styled herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis. Her mornings may have included prayers or offerings at a household shrine, though the details are uncertain. Egyptian tradition tied the ruler to rituals performed at temples, but Cleopatra was unusual. She balanced Greek and Egyptian practices, which meant her mornings may have felt like a careful negotiation of identity. Food and diet. Breakfast in Cleopatra's palace would have been simple. The Egyptians' daily diet revolved around bread and beer. Cleopatra's meals were, of course, finer and more varied than those of common laborers, but they were rooted in the same staples. Bread was made from emmer wheat, ground into flour, and baked into dense loaves. It was often flavored with honey, dates, or herbs. Beer was thick, more like a porridge than the clear beverages you know today, and it was consumed by all classes. As queen, Cleopatra's table would also have included delicacies: figs, grapes, pomegranates, and olives brought from across the Mediterranean. Fish and poultry were common in Egypt, while beef was more restricted due to the expense of raising cattle. Wine, imported from Greece and later produced in Egypt itself, was another sign of elite status. Yet for all her wealth, Cleopatra's diet was not decadent in the way later Roman banquets would become. Meals were practical, fueling the long hours of governance that lay ahead. Governing duties. By mid-morning, Cleopatra would turn to the business of ruling. Ancient kingdoms did not run themselves, and Egypt in Cleopatra's time was a vast, complicated state. She inherited a land in decline. Her father, Ptolemy XII, had left Egypt heavily in debt to Rome, its fields struggling under economic strain, and its political stability fragile. As queen, Cleopatra's survival depended on her ability to manage this delicate situation. Her mornings were likely filled with councils and audiences. Officials, priests, military commanders, and foreign envoys came to her court with petitions, reports, and demands. Taxes had to be collected, disputes judged, and policies decreed. Unlike many rulers who delegated such tasks, Cleopatra is noted for her direct involvement. Ancient writers, even her enemies, commented on her intelligence and her ability to speak multiple languages, some said as many as 9. This meant she did not always need interpreters when meeting foreign visitors, and she could hear directly from her subjects. The details of these meetings may sound dull, but they were the fabric of her reign. Imagine Cleopatra seated in a grand hall, columns rising around her, officials waiting nervously for their turn to speak. She might hear from a tax collector reporting on grain yields from the Nile Delta. She might consult with military leaders about unrest in the eastern provinces. She might even meet with scholars from the Library of Alexandria, which was closely tied to the Ptolemaic court, to discuss works being copied or studied. Each meeting shaped Egypt's stability, even if none of them involved the grand gestures remembered in plays and films. The library and learning. One of the quieter aspects of Cleopatra's reign, but one that likely influenced her daily life, was Alexandria's role as a center of learning. The Library of Alexandria and the associated Mouseion were legendary repositories of knowledge. While we cannot know exactly how much Cleopatra herself engaged with the library, her dynasty had long been patrons of scholarship. It is reasonable to imagine that she had scholars in her court who advised her on matters ranging from astronomy to medicine to history. For Cleopatra, knowledge was political power. Understanding the Nile's cycles of flooding was vital for agriculture and taxation. Understanding Roman politics was essential for survival. Even the study of medicine may have played a role, as rulers were often associated with healing powers. Her intellectual engagement added to her reputation as a ruler who was not only regal but clever, a quality that distinguished her in a male-dominated political world. the quiet burden of ceremony. Throughout the day, Cleopatra also had to participate in ceremonies that reinforced her position as both queen and goddess. These ranged from receiving offerings in her palace to appearing in public processions. Such duties were exhausting in their repetition. Every gesture mattered: how she entered a hall, the clothing she wore, the words she spoke to the priests. The people of Egypt needed constant reassurance that their ruler embodied Ma'at, the cosmic order. For Cleopatra, this was both a duty and a performance, one that required endless attention to detail. In the heat of the Egyptian afternoon, she may have taken periods of rest. Palaces were designed with shaded courtyards and breezeways to provide relief from the sun. Servants would fan the queen, bring cool water scented with lotus, or lay out fruit for refreshment. These moments of pause were short, for even in rest, she was never truly free of her responsibilities. A queen's life was not her own. It was bound to the demands of the state. Evening life. As the day drew toward evening, Cleopatra's schedule would not have eased. Banquets and dinners were both social and political events. Guests at her table might include Egyptian nobles, Greek courtiers, foreign ambassadors, and Roman visitors. Meals were opportunities to solidify alliances, to negotiate agreements, or to display Egypt's wealth. The food might grow more elaborate in the evening: roasted goose, spiced lamb, dishes flavored with garlic, coriander, or cumin. Musicians and poets could provide entertainment. Yet the underlying purpose was serious: maintaining networks of loyalty that were essential for Egypt's fragile independence. When the banquets ended, Cleopatra would retreat to her private chambers. Here, at last, she may have had time to herself, though even then she was not free from concern. The Queen of Egypt slept in a palace surrounded by guards, attendants, and whispers of court intrigue. Cleopatra's daily life, then, was not a string of dramatic encounters, but rather a routine of ritual, governance, ceremony, and careful diplomacy. It was a life of endless details, each one necessary to maintain the fragile balance of power that kept her throne secure. And yet, as she lay in her chambers at night, listening to the hum of Alexandria beyond the palace walls, one must wonder, did Cleopatra ever long for a day without ceremony, without councils, without the heavy weight of divine kingship pressing upon her? Power, politics, and the burdens of rule. When you picture Cleopatra, you might think first of her beauty or her famous alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Yet beauty and romance were only fragments of her existence. In reality, her life was consumed by politics, administration, and the relentless calculations necessary to preserve Egypt's fragile sovereignty in an era when Rome dominated the Mediterranean world. In this section, we will move deeper into the political and economic details of her reign. Details that may sound tedious at first, but which reveal how Cleopatra kept her kingdom alive amid foreign threats, domestic unrest, and endless debts. Egypt's fragile independence. To understand Cleopatra's challenges, you must remember the broader context of the 1st century BCE. Egypt was no longer the mighty empire it had once been during the New Kingdom, when pharaohs like Ramses II commanded armies across vast territories. Instead, by Cleopatra's time, Egypt was a wealthy but vulnerable state, hemmed in by Roman power. The Ptolemaic dynasty, to which Cleopatra belonged, had ruled Egypt since 305 BCE, when Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals, declared himself king. Over the centuries, the dynasty grew increasingly entangled with Rome. By the time Cleopatra came to the throne in 51 BCE, Egypt was technically independent, but in practice, it was already a client kingdom of Rome. Her father, Ptolemy XII, had relied heavily on Roman support to stay in power, and in exchange he had emptied Egypt's treasury to pay Rome enormous bribes. When Cleopatra inherited the throne, she also inherited these debts. This meant much of her reign was not about conquest or luxury, but about balancing Egypt's internal economy with the external pressures of Roman demands. She needed to keep her people fed, her officials paid, and her soldiers loyal, all while sending tribute to Rome to prevent intervention. The work was tedious but critical. Without careful management, her dynasty would collapse. Bureaucracy and record-keeping. One of Cleopatra's greatest tools was Egypt's bureaucracy. The Egyptians had a long tradition of meticulous record-keeping, dating back to the time of the pharaohs. Scribes recorded tax collections, crop yields, census data, and trade flows. These records were not glamorous, but they allowed Cleopatra to understand the resources at her disposal. Consider the grain harvest. Egypt's economy revolved around the Nile's annual flooding, which deposited fertile soil on the riverbanks. Good floods meant good harvests. Poor floods meant famine. As queen, Cleopatra needed constant reports from across the land to know whether her grain reserves would be sufficient. Grain was both food for her people and currency for trade, especially with Rome. Managing it required endless lists, calculations, and decrees. Inscriptions and papyri from the Ptolemaic era reveal how detailed this system was. Taxes could be paid in kind, such as grain or livestock, or in money. Every stage of production was tracked. Farmers owed a portion of their wheat, fishermen a portion of their catch, artisans a tax on their goods. Officials in Alexandria compiled this information and presented it to the queen. Cleopatra may not have reviewed every tablet herself, but she was certainly aware of the broader trends. The monotonous rhythm of taxation was the backbone of her reign. Cleopatra as a financial administrator. Cleopatra was not a passive monarch. Ancient sources suggest she was deeply involved in financial decisions. For example, she devalued Egypt's currency by introducing coins with lower silver content, a decision aimed at stretching the kingdom's limited resources. Such measures were unpopular but necessary. She also invested in trade. Egypt was strategically positioned along the eastern Mediterranean, and Alexandria was one of the busiest ports of the ancient world. Goods from Africa, Arabia, and India passed through Egypt before reaching Rome and Greece. Cleopatra encouraged this trade, knowing that tariffs and customs duties could replenish her treasury. Again, these were not glamorous decisions, but they were essential for survival. The politics of religion. Another part of Cleopatra's daily life that carried both ceremonial and political weight was her role as high priestess of Egyptian religion. Unlike her Greek predecessors, she embraced the Egyptian gods fully. She styled herself as the living embodiment of Isis, a goddess associated with motherhood, fertility, and protection. This was not just personal devotion, it was a political strategy. By aligning herself with Isis, Cleopatra could appeal directly to her Egyptian subjects, who might otherwise have seen her as a foreign ruler. Every ritual, every procession, every temple visit reinforced her image as both queen and goddess. These religious duties may have seemed repetitive, but they were vital in holding together a diverse population. Egypt was a multicultural society. Greek elites lived in Alexandria. Egyptians filled the countryside. Jews had a strong community in the city, and traders from many lands passed through. Rituals and public ceremonies helped unify this mosaic under Cleopatra's authority. Relations with Rome. Of course, Cleopatra's reign cannot be separated from her dealings with Rome. But what is often overlooked is how much of this relationship was rooted in practical administration, not just romance. When Julius Caesar came to Egypt in 48 BCE, he found a kingdom in turmoil. Cleopatra was embroiled in a civil war with her brother Ptolemy XIII. Aligning with Caesar gave her the military support she needed to win, but it also bound her more tightly to Rome. Later, her alliance with Mark Antony would serve a similar purpose, ensuring that Egypt had protection from Rome's enemies. Behind the dramatic love stories was a constant stream of negotiations, debts, and trade agreements. Cleopatra provided Rome with grain, money, and ships. In return, she received recognition as Egypt's rightful ruler. These arrangements were as dull as any modern diplomatic treaty, but they were the real substance of her political life. The burden of image. Every day, Cleopatra had to maintain her image not only as a ruler, but as a symbol. To her Egyptian subjects, she was Isis reborn. To the Greeks of Alexandria, she was the rightful heir of the Ptolemaic line. To the Romans, she was both ally and exotic monarch. Balancing these identities was exhausting. Imagine her preparing for a meeting with Roman envoys. She might don Greek-style robes to emphasize her Hellenistic heritage. For Egyptian festivals, she would wear traditional pharaonic garb. Each setting required a different version of Cleopatra, carefully constructed to satisfy the audience. This constant shifting of identity was a form of political survival, though it likely weighed heavily on her. The quiet threats. It is easy to forget how precarious Cleopatra's position was. Unlike the idealized depictions of her as all-powerful, she was constantly surrounded by threats. Her own siblings plotted against her. Roman politicians debated whether Egypt should be annexed. Famine or unrest could spark rebellion at any moment. Her daily work, therefore, was not about expansion or glory but about endurance. Every tax decree, every temple visit, every audience with an envoy was part of a larger effort to keep Egypt intact for one more year, one more season of the Nile, one more harvest. Alexandria at night. As night fell over Alexandria, Cleopatra's palace would glow with lamplight. Outside, the city buzzed with activity. Merchants unloading goods at the harbor, sailors singing, scholars debating in courtyards, priests tending shrines. Within the palace walls, Cleopatra might host another banquet, or she might retreat into discussions with her advisors. Perhaps she reviewed the day's reports, or spoke with scholars about the stars and their influence on fortune. Astrology was deeply respected in her time, and rulers often consulted horoscopes before making decisions. Did Cleopatra gaze at the night sky above Alexandria, wondering whether the constellations favored her reign? In the quiet hours, her thoughts must have returned again and again to the same question. How long could Egypt remain independent? With Rome's shadow looming larger each year, Every administrative decision carried the weight of survival. Thus, Cleopatra's life, while remembered for its passion and drama, was in truth shaped by bureaucracy, taxation, religious rituals, and endless political calculation. It was a life spent in the details, the kinds of details that rarely make for epic stories, but without which her dynasty could not have endured as long as it did. And yet, as the years passed and Rome's grip grew tighter, one must ask, could all her efforts, her careful administration, her religious devotion, her alliances, truly preserve Egypt's independence, or was she merely delaying the inevitable? The final years and the weight of legacy. By now, you have walked with Cleopatra through her mornings filled with ritual, her afternoons steeped in councils, and her evenings crowded with banquets and negotiations. You have seen how her reign was less about grand gestures of love and more about the slow, steady grind of administration, taxation, and ceremony. Yet no account of Cleopatra's life can end there, because the most tedious, almost bureaucratic details of her final years carried consequences that would outlast her and alter the entire course of Mediterranean history. In this section, we will turn to the last decade of her life, when the delicate balance she had maintained between Egypt's independence and Rome's dominance began to unravel. It is here, in the precise calculations of tribute, alliances, and diplomacy, that her story reached its fateful conclusion: the alliance with Mark Antony. After the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE, Rome plunged into chaos. The empire was not yet an empire. It was still technically a republic, but the republic was tearing itself apart. Rival generals and politicians fought for supremacy, and Egypt, though geographically distant, could not escape Rome's turbulence. For Cleopatra, the question was simple yet exhausting. Whom could she trust to secure Egypt's future? The answer, at least for a time, was Mark Antony. Antony was one of the triumvirs, the three men who divided Rome's territories among themselves in the years after Caesar's death. He controlled the eastern provinces, which meant Cleopatra had to work with him whether she wished to or not. Much has been made of their romance, but what matters for our purposes are the endless logistics of their alliance. Antony needed ships, soldiers, and money. Cleopatra needed Roman protection. Their relationship was sealed less in the glamour of feasts than in the signing of agreements, the tallying of grain shipments, and the dispatching of troops. Cleopatra funded Antony's campaigns with Egypt's wealth, sending fleets and resources across the Mediterranean. These were practical, even boring acts of administration, but they tied Egypt's fate ever more tightly to Rome's internal struggles. The economy under strain. Cleopatra's support for Antony did not come cheaply. Egypt was already carrying heavy debts from her father's reign and her early years as queen. Now, with Antony's wars demanding resources, the pressure increased. Once again, the Nile's annual floods played a decisive role. A good flood could sustain Egypt's grain surplus and allow Cleopatra to meet Rome's demands. A poor flood could plunge the country into hardship. The queen's officials tracked the inundation carefully, measuring the river with nilometers, stone pillars carved with marks to record the water's height. Reports flowed to Alexandria, where Cleopatra's court weighed how much grain could be spared for Rome without starving the Egyptian people. You might think of these as dull calculations, the sort of thing relegated to scribes and accountants. Yet in these numbers lay the fate of nations. If Cleopatra miscalculated, Egypt could face rebellion at home or lose Rome's support abroad. Every tally of grain, every shipment of silver, every record of taxation was part of a larger equation of survival. Public ceremonies and propaganda. Cleopatra also turned increasingly to spectacle, not only to reinforce her divine status, but to display Egypt's strength to Rome and her own people. Yet even this had a tedious, procedural side. Take, for example, the famous Donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE. During this event, Cleopatra and Antony staged a grand ceremony in which Antony declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings and distributed territories of the eastern Mediterranean to her children. To ancient audiences, this was an impressive display of wealth and authority. But behind the pageantry lay meticulous preparation. Accountants calculating Egypt's resources, craftsmen producing costumes and regalia, priests rehearsing rituals, and officials drafting proclamations. It was, at its heart, Another exercise in administration, one more attempt to balance appearances with reality. Cleopatra needed the Egyptian people to believe in her divine power, and she needed Rome to see her as a partner worth keeping. Every procession, every feast, every speech was a political document in performance form, the shadow of Octavian. Yet, even as Cleopatra and Antony built their alliance, another Roman figure was rising. Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar and Antony's rival. Octavian was calculating, disciplined, and relentless. Where Antony enjoyed luxury and spectacle, Octavian cultivated an image of austerity and traditional Roman values. In Rome's political climate, this gave him an advantage. Step by step, he turned the Roman Senate against Antony and Cleopatra, portraying them as decadent rulers who threatened Roman order. Cleopatra, for all her intelligence, could not control this narrative. She could send ships, negotiate treaties, and perform rituals in Alexandria, but she could not silence Octavian's propaganda machine. Each day, her officials and advisors must have reported on Rome's shifting mood, the Senate's debates, and the speeches against her. Each report must have weighed on her, adding to the monotony of survival. How many more taxes could be levied? How many more alliances made before Rome turned its full might against her? The final war. By 32 BCE, the inevitable had come. Rome declared war, not on Antony alone, but on Cleopatra herself. Officially, the war was justified as a defense of Rome's dignity against a foreign queen. In practice, it was Octavian's bid to eliminate his rivals. The details of this war are remembered in dramatic episodes like the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, but behind the naval clashes lay months of preparation that consumed Cleopatra's court. Ships had to be built and equipped. Crews had to be trained and fed. Supplies had to be stockpiled. Every step required officials, scribes, and laborers working day after day, producing records and reports. Imagine the warehouses of Alexandria filled with timber, ropes, sails, and provisions. Imagine the scribes writing out orders for grain shipments to feed the soldiers. Imagine the priests performing rituals to bless the fleet before it sailed. These are the details that rarely make it into epic poetry, but they were the true texture of Cleopatra's final struggle. When the fleet met Octavian's forces at Actium, the outcome was disastrous. Antony and Cleopatra's ships were trapped and outmaneuvered. The queen, recognizing the battle was lost, retreated with her fleet, leaving Antony to follow. Their armies collapsed, and Octavian pursued them to Egypt. The end of a dynasty. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra faced her final months. Even here, the details of her life were not grandiose, but administrative. She secured treasures in her mausoleum, prepared defenses for the city, and negotiated desperately with Octavian's envoys. The famous story of her suicide, by ASP or by poison, is remembered as a dramatic act of defiance. But before that moment came days, even weeks, of mundane but pressing concerns. Which soldiers would remain loyal? Which gates of the city should be fortified? Which treasures should be hidden? And which offered as bribes? Cleopatra's end was not a single gesture, but a prolonged process of administration under siege. In 30 BCE, when Octavian finally captured Alexandria, Cleopatra ended her life rather than be paraded through Rome in chains. With her death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended, and Egypt became a Roman province. Legacy and reflection. And yet, in reflecting on Cleopatra's daily life, one must look beyond her death. Her reign illustrates how much of history is built not on moments of passion or drama, but on the quieter, repetitive actions of governance. Her careful management of taxes, her attention to ritual, her balancing of identities. All these were acts of endurance that kept Egypt independent for nearly 2 decades longer than might have been expected. Rome was destined to dominate, but Cleopatra's boring, persistent work delayed the inevitable. In doing so, she ensured that Egypt remained not a conquered territory, but a kingdom negotiating on its own terms until the very end. Today, Cleopatra is remembered as a symbol of seduction and power. But perhaps her true legacy lies in the less glamorous aspects of her reign, in the meticulous bureaucracy she oversaw, in the rituals she performed, in the economic strategies she devised. These are the details that held a nation together, even as the mightiest power in the world pressed against it. As you think of Cleopatra lying in her palace chambers for the last time, you might ask yourself, if history remembers the spectacle, but life is lived in the details, what truly defines a ruler? The image they project, or the tedious but essential work they do each day?